expect more, achieve more. James Macpherson was an obscure Scottish Highlander, and he lived in the 1760s when he perpetrated this literary fraud. And he was poor, and he was looking for fame and fortune. So what he did was somebody asked him, "Do you have any ancient Gaelic poetry?" And he pulled out these translations, quote unquote. And the translations turned out later on to be totally made up by Macpherson, but people didn't understand Gaelic literature. The Gaelic speakers were dying out at the time, so Macpherson not only pulled out a first poem, but he started a collection, and then Scottish patrons asked him to put together a whole book of these translations, and he proceeded to do so, 3 volumes in about 3 years, and he became rich and he became famous until Samuel Johnson decided that this was entirely a big hoax, and he went to Scotland and into the Highlands on a trip with a famous Scotsman by the name of James Boswell. He searched for the so-called originals from which these translations were made. They never showed up. Johnson wrote a travel book, A Journey to the Western Islands of Scotland, and he practically called Macpherson a liar. Macpherson retaliated after the book came out and challenged Johnson to a duel. The difference of age, Johnson was in his 60s, Macpherson's in his 40s, a big robust man. So Johnson, a fearless man himself, walked around London streets, took an oak truncheon and said, "I will take care of myself." Samuel Johnson had every reason to be very offended by what he considered to be, and rightly so, a huge hoax, because Johnson, the most famous writer in England in the second half of the 18th century, is England's greatest moralist, greatest literary critic, and this hit at the heart, perpetrating lying, duping a reading public. It hit at the heart of what he stood for. And though he didn't have the critical tools that we have today to know exactly to what large extent Macpherson's Ossian poems are a lie, he intuited that they were basically made up, and he was absolutely correct. And the book that I've just published, Samuel Johnson, The Ossian Fraud, and the Celtic Revival in Great Britain and Ireland, is an attempt to discover the full extent. It's the most careful study to date of just how right Johnson was and how much of a liar James Macpherson, the Scotsman, was. Many people looking at the controversy between James Macpherson, the Scotsman, and Johnson, the Englishman, saw this as symptomatic of an English superiority complex. The United Kingdom, it turned out, during the time of the American Revolution, was not so united. Scots were very prickly about their national heritage. The English tended to believe they were the superior sort of the makeup of Great Britain, and the poor Irish felt that Macpherson and the Scots were taking their Gaelic legends and calling it their own, so they were angry. The age of fraud, unfortunately, is by no means isolated in the 18th century. Fraudulent literature has been produced probably since cavemen made figures in the caves, and the 20th century certainly has many fraudulent forms of literature on record, and Johnson believed that this kind of perpetration of fraud just weakens the bonds of society, of individual to individual, and I believe that my book sheds light on why Johnson was correct to demand truth in life and literature. The scholarship in the book, it reads, if I may say so, it has the exciting feel, reading my book, of a detective novel, of what I had to do over the last 10 years, researching on site in England, Scotland, and Ireland, what it was like to have to uncover gradually the layers and layers of fraud. I had to consult with Gaelic specialists in the field, had to bone up a bit on Gaelic myself, and I also had to read the original extant Gaelic literature in Scotland and Ireland. And lo and behold, gradually taking the 57 or so different titles in the Ossian canon, the things that Macpherson made up, I compared it with the original and found out that 3/4 of the 57 pieces, 3/4 of that canon were entirely made up. There was nothing behind it. And the other quarter was based on a few cues from a few genuine forms of Gaelic literature. And we've had scholars writing books right up to the present time saying this is perhaps genuine in part, and we can learn a great deal about Gaelic culture and Gaelic literature, and what an inspiration, and in fact it has been an inspiration for European, English, and American literature from the Romantic period on to the present, and yet all these great writers were following basically a fraud. Substantial work based on emptiness.